While I have to discipline myself not to visit the Danish bakeries too often, I do enjoy indulging in the Danish Gambit. It occurs from you playing the second move pawn to d4, offering this Gambit pawn, following up with pawn to c3, and as they accept the second pawn, I then prefer to recapture with the knight straight away. And below the level 1600, you just obliterate everybody. Literally, they have no hope. And I'm going to show you everything, all the variations, so that you're fully ready to face whatever your opponents are ready to use. I'm Grandmaster Igor Smirnov, and let's rock and roll. In most of the cases, your opponents are going to develop their knights and their bishop to b4 in one or the other order. Some of your opponents will bring the bishop out to c5, which is usually worse. We'll talk about all these options. Let's start off with bishop to b4, pinning your knight. To this, you just reply with bishop to c4, putting your bishop to this very active diagonal, and it really helps you to initiate this quick attack in many of the following variations. Now, sometimes they'll trade on c3, if not, no problem, we'll talk about that in a moment just as well. But it feels natural for black to trade the bishop for the knight because they're up a pawn, therefore they wish to simplify matters, to trade off some material, also they ruin your pawn structure a little bit, and here they may play knight to f6. It is hard to believe, but this natural, trivial move knight to f6 is virtually already a losing error. You just push the pawn forward, and that is one of the very standard ideas for you to initiate your attack. Now, what can black really do here? This knight is kind of running out of squares to go to. It clearly can't go to d5, you're going to capture this. It also can't move along this diagonal because your queen would then capture the knight. Finally, knight to e4 fails to queen d5. That is another standard tactical idea here. That is a double attack and you're going to win something, either a checkmate or win the knight. Therefore, that is also not an option. Of course, they could just passively retreat back to the starting position, kind of preparing it for the next game to begin, but certainly you don't mind having that outcome. Some will try queen e7, pinning the pawn and attacking it, but that also doesn't really help. You can play queen e2, unpin the pawn, and renew the threat to the knight. Therefore, black is faced with the very same problem. Ultimately, they have to bring it back to g8, and then you just develop. Now, after they bring the other knight, you can castle, and now they're still facing the very same issue. The pawn on e5 takes away this square, and therefore they can't develop. They play pawn d6, hoping to trade queens and also get rid of this annoying pawn. But you can reply with bishop g5, the first unpleasant surprise. You counter-strike and attack the queen. The queen cannot move away from the e-file because then you would take and open up this discover check. Therefore, they need to play pawn f6. Then you capture. At this point, they're really happy because they see an opportunity to trade off queens and they hope that this will end your attack. And by the way, they have no choice anyways, because otherwise you just move the queen out and then play rook e1 and win with your attack along the e-file. Also, they can't ever castle because of your bishop control in this square. Therefore, they take on e2, and here you play another brilliant move. Pawn takes g7. At the moment, black is up a whole queen, but they're losing the game because there is no way for them to stop your pawn from being promoted and grabbing the rook along the way. Plus, their queen is attacked. For example, queen takes c4, you then capture and promote to a queen, and now that is a complete devastation. The king is wide open, you're ready to play rook e1 check, your queen is very active along the last rank, you're ready to either put pressure there or take this pawn if necessary. Like, all in all, that is easily winning. Here's another very common way to win games. I'm sure you will win a couple of games exactly following this move order. Now, normally they wish to develop their knights. Like there's a classical rule, knights before bishops. But they realize that bringing this knight out does not really work because you'll play e5 and kick it off straight away. Therefore, they usually bring this other knight first. Then you play bishop c4, put in your bishop to this active diagonal. After this, they play knight f6. And at the moment, you can't play e5 straight away because his knight controls the square. Therefore, you play knight f3, which develops your knight and also prepares this move pawn e5. They'll usually play bishop b4, creating this pin and getting ready to castle. At this point, they're feeling good, but as always, you launch your attack by going pawn to e5. Now, you can't do that because you've got your knight that supports this advancement, therefore, they cannot capture it. They have to deal with this attack. And as they go knight e4, again, they still feel very good. They see that this knight is pinned, and they're attacking it for the second time in a row. They're up a pawn, they're ready to castle. It feels like they're living it up, but you end the celebration by going queen to d5. We've talked about that before, and that is another very common tactical pattern. You threaten checkmate on f7 thanks to this battery, but if they castle or do anything, they could play this in between check, but that doesn't change anything. They're still faced with the same double attack, and after they castle, you just grab this undefended knight on e4. And at this point, not only you're up a knight, but you keep attacking. You have more space and more freedom for your pieces to move forward one way or the other, and attack him differently along many diagonals. For example, if they go d6, that is their last hope to somehow get your pawn out and then play rook e8, beating your queen and king. That is what they're dreaming about. And there is one more way to really humiliate your opponent. You can go knight g5, threatening this checkmate. They have to stop that. They go on pawn g6. And now you kind of pretend like you blundered their idea. You capture this pawn on d6. At this point, your opponent will gladly play rook e8, thinking, okay, gotcha, finally. But then you play bishop takes f7, and it turns out that once again he was tricked. Notice that is why we played knight g5 on the previous move. The bishop is guarded. But then, thanks to this bishop attack, that is another double attack. And this time we're grabbing the rook and win the game. So far we've talked about them bringing their bishop out to b4, trying to pin your knight. However, some of your opponents will play bishop c5, kind of like they do in the Italian game. And that fails straight away to bishop takes f7, which is another common tactical idea worth remembering here. After king takes f7, it turns out that it was not even a sacrifice, really, because you can follow up with either queen to d5 or even queen to h5, and in both cases that's going to be a double attack to his king and bishop, for example, with queen to d5, which means that on the next move you can get it back with interest. Not only you grab this pawn on the f7 in the meantime, but also let's not forget that the king has moved back and forth, meaning that it cannot castle in this game anymore. It's going to stay there in the middle of the board, and you're going to simply continue your development, castle, and after that go all out onto this king in the middle of the board, and you have a winning position right away. Even if they bring the other knight out first, it does not change the situation. If they play bishop c5 on the next move, you can still make use of the same idea. You can't play bishop takes f7 straight away because there is no move queen to d5 as a follow-up. His knight controls the square. But we have another standard option. Pawn e5 push, kicking this knight away, and after this you do the exact same thing. Bishop takes f7, king takes, followed by queen d5, double attack, king goes, queen takes c5, and then you keep going with bishop g5, castle, knight d5, all that stuff, and you just win the game. At this point you may have another question, like, Igor, if black is always suffering due to this move pawn to e5, why can't black just play pawn d6, control the square, and then it's all over, black is just a pawn up? It's not all that simple, because in this case, although they indeed stopped you from going forward with pawn e5, but they slowed down their development. The bishop has not been developed yet, therefore they cannot castle yet, and you can take advantage of that by going queen b3, hitting this square f7. And now, if the bishop was developed previously, black would be able to castle, but that's not the case right now. Therefore, they have to guard this pawn somehow, and they have to play an awkward queen move. Usually, they play queen e7, which is wrong. Queen d7 is better, but this is so intricate that most of your opponents will not figure it out, and queen e7 feels like a more natural move to play, because not only they guard this pawn, but they somewhat oppose it to your king. In reality, that is already a losing error. You just castle here, and after that, your opponent is completely stuck. They can't really do anything. They can't develop this bishop, therefore they can't castle. They can't develop this bishop as well because it has to guard this pawn on b7. They just have a very hard time untangling their pieces. They'll usually try out this knight a5 move, which is yet another mistake, really. They're hoping to somehow attack you right here and trade off the bishop maybe. But the thing is, after queen a4, that is a counter double attack of the knight and the king. Therefore, if black wants to save this knight at all, they have to move it back, which means that their knight a5 idea was just a waste of time. And after that, you can win in a multiple different ways. Just bringing bishop g5 and knight d5, rook e1, like plain simple, is enough to win. But there is also a more forced way. You can go knight g5, hitting this pawn on f7. At this point, there is just a single way for black to defend it, possibly just bishop e6. This knight cannot move because it's pinned down to the king. But if they go bishop e6, you can trade it off, and at this point, you've got a winning move. By the way, let it be a puzzle of the day, because a puzzle a day keeps losses away, so please think about this, and if you can find the winning solution for white here, the winning move, please write it down in comments below. Let me address another doubt you may have. In these type of positions, after they develop their pieces and you strike them with pawn e5, they realize that they're in trouble. They'll sometimes trade on c3 or not, does not really matter, and play queen e7. because they realize that the knight has no convenient squares to go to, and therefore they try to make use of the pin and maybe simply capture your opponent on the next move. However, usually in these variations that is not a problem at all, because if you're ready to castle, you can do just that and ignore their threat to this pawn completely. You can just castle, which moves your king away, meaning there is no pin any longer, and you can capture this knight on the next move. However, taking this pawn on e5 is never an option for them, because at the end of this trade you go rook e1 and you win the game thanks to this pin. Therefore, if we take a move back, they have to anyway move this knight somewhere, and therefore this move queen e7 was just a waste of time. That did not change the situation. After knight to e4, let's say they attack your pawn, you don't have to care about it. You have such a strong attacking position, you can just keep going, keep bringing pieces into play and attacking. For example, rook e1, hitting the knight again. And after knight takes c3, you can play queen b3, and the knight is actually trapped. This playful pony was horsing around, and now there is no way out. Queen b4 is the only way to try to save the knight, and possibly black hopes to trade queens, but there is a very unpleasant surprise here. Bishop takes f7 check, and maybe your opponent anticipated that and thought, okay, that's not a problem, I'll just move my king away and then trade queens and I'm still good. But here they start realizing that, wait a second, where can the king go? If it goes here or here to one of these two squares, then you actually win the game by going bishop a3, and you use this pin to win their queen. Therefore, they think, okay, I'm gonna go that way. But now you kind of accept their invitation and you trade queens, but then you follow up with bishop g5. Very unexpected checkmate. Alright, now let me address the elephant in the room, because you can turn on Stockfish and it will tell you that the position is about equal, and then you'll think, oh, there's just nothing special about this. But, you know, the chess game is equal. If both sides play perfect chess, it's going to be a draw. But in real life, we never have an opponent who is capable of playing perfect chess. Therefore, in real life, below 1600 is going to work perfectly well, and even below 2000, you're usually going to get into all these juicy variations. Anyway, let me tell you a couple other what-ifs. What if your opponent does not want to take this pawn at all? Well, he's got to do something, because otherwise you're going to capture that pawn. If they go knight c6, that's actually a pretty bad idea, because you can push d5 and kick this knight out straight away. They have to either retreat somewhere back to a passive position, just allowing you to gain space, and then knight c6 was rather a waste of time, or if they try to go forward, you keep playing c3, keep chasing the knight, and the knight is actually trapped. What they're missing here usually is that they play knight b5 thinking that that square is available, but what they're missing is the sniper from f1, and you capture on b5 playing a much better version of the Ruy Lopez, where not only you develop a bishop to b5, but you win the game playing so. Also, black may try to take this pawn, but then not capture the other one on c3, and they can play something like knight c6. What do you do then? Well, of course you could recapture, there is nothing wrong with that, but if you want to play that Danish Gambit variations we talked about before, you can just play knight f3 yourself and kind of attack this pawn again, and in most cases they will still play pawn takes c3, which will transpose into all the same variations. Finally, so what is the correct solution for black? In most of these variations, as we enter that critical position when you are ready to push the pawn forward and you do so, we know that if they try to move the knight away or play queen e7, all those natural moves actually lose the game. What they have to come up with here is a counter-strike pawn to d5 in this and other similar variations, and this move keeps them in the game. But in most cases your opponents will be unable to find this move because it's a very counterintuitive idea. Not only their knight is still attacked and they don't do anything about that, but d5 puts the pawn under seemingly 3 attacks of your pieces, plus you can take en passant. So again, it's a very counterintuitive move here to play. But the thing here is d5 is actually the best idea. But there is nothing really dangerous for you. As we keep trading everything, you can then trade queens and force him to move one of his pieces to an undesirable position. Then you can grab this pawn on g7, attacking the rook, and as we enter this final position of this forced variation, we land in an approximately equal endgame. So if the best that your opponent can possibly achieve is an equal position, like, it's not too bad after all. And again, in most of the cases your opponent won't be able to find this variation anyways. Now you may be thinking, Igor, all these variations are spectacular, but either I will forget them right after watching the video, or my opponents will surely play something else and I will mess up. Well, you cannot memorize everything in chess, and there is no need to. You need to understand the fundamental principles, and then correct moves seem natural, logical, and you can get them naturally. I'd recommend that you check out my free masterclass by clicking the link up there or somewhere below in the description, where I show you those few simple guidelines of how I find proper moves and how you can do the same.